The Fed Committee, chaired with habitual reluctance by Mr. Spetig of the hardware shop, had declared the annual summer gathering a modest triumph, which in Flaxborough meant fewer collapses than last year, and only two confirmed rivalries rekindled. The bunting held through the wind. The Punch and Judy man, though clearly hungover, kept to his cue card. Even the rector's address, delivered from a precariously amplified trestle, passed without theological misadventure. Inside the town hall, the atmosphere was marginally more volatile. There, in the subdued aftermath of civic revelry, trays of sponge and ham sandwiches lay in exhausted heaps beneath a haze of weak tea and jam preserve. Several of the town's older gentlemen, who had put themselves forward for stewarding roles solely for proximity to the port, lingered near the buffet with the unfocused manner of men recalculating cholesterol risks. It was beside the remains of a sherry trifle, damp and vaguely resentful in its glass dish, that Mr. Clement Hargreave began to perspire. He had been speaking, if such a word may be used, to Mrs. Glossop of the Ladies' Civic Rectitude Circle. His contributions to the conversation had, until the moment of his discomposure, consisted of faint nods and a single syllable, quite, used twice with variable effect. It was during a monologue on the moral deficiencies of sponge finger advertising that his complexion lost its traditional parish pink. "My dear," Mrs. Glossop was saying, "if this is how society communicates moral direction these days, then I shan't be surprised to see undergarments sponsored by the diocese." Hargreave blinked. He seemed briefly to lose the function of elbows. Then, with something between a cough and a deeply buried apology, he excused himself and moved, not swiftly, but certainly with purpose, toward the vestibule. It was generally agreed by those present that he had looked strained, and that trifle might have been an unwise third course. By 8 o'clock that evening, with the folding chairs stacked and the bunting wrestled into the broom cupboard, Inspector Purbright sat alone in his office. He was reviewing reports from the Fete, mostly mild disputes over stall allocations, one instance of alleged cake plagiarism, and a mislabeled tombola prize that turned out to be an empty bottle of brandy. The room, with its usual scent of polished lino and undisturbed filing, was not built for revelations. So when the door opened and Mr. Hargreave entered, hair damp, gaze anxious, it was not immediately clear that the evening would prove eventful. "I hesitate to impose," Hargreave began, with the formality of a man unaccustomed to imposing in any other way. Purbright gestured toward the wooden chair opposite. "By all means." There was a brief interlude while Hargreave settled his handkerchief on his knee. He stared at it as though it might begin speaking first. "I should like to speak," he said at length, in confidence. Purbright inclined his head. "There is—" Hargreave cleared his throat. "There has been an indiscretion." There was silence, comfortably padded. Outside, a late bicycle bell chimed faintly, as if signaling agreement. "Not a crime exactly," Hargreave added hurriedly. "Not by statute, but a matter of, shall we say, moral confusion. One that now appears to have become interred." Purbright allowed one eyebrow to hover, inviting elaboration without insisting upon it. Hargreave's eyes darted toward the window, as though concerned it might report him to someone. "She hasn't been seen. Not since early June." "She," Purbright repeated neutrally. A nod. "You may have heard of her. Miss Teague, Lucilla. She was not, officially, attached to anyone, but she was appreciated." Purbright made no comment. He did not need to. The name had surfaced before, drifting into the periphery of minor scandals and whispered regrets. Miss Teague had held no post, attended no committees, and wore quiet gloves to the post office. Yet her presence had been curiously noted in the margins of respectable calendars. I believed, Hargreaves said, that she had left town, chosen a retreat of some kind, but certain signs have suggested otherwise. Signs, Hargreave coughed. A floral arrangement, left on a windowsill, unseasonal lilies. Purbright looked at him a moment longer, then wrote a single word in his notebook. It might have been interred, or it might have been trifle. The interview concluded with mild assurances and the promise that nothing official need be said at this stage. Hargreave departed with a faint bow, as though hoping good manners might retroactively amend history. By morning, the North Flaxborough Bugle carried a small, ambiguous item in its women's section. Several have inquired after Miss Lucilla Teague, last seen at the Rotary picnic. Her blue parasol remains unclaimed. Those with information are invited to speak to Mrs. Glossop, strictest discretion assured. The editor, Miss Dolores Judd, had appended the notice with a signature quote: "A town without questions has either nothing to hide or everything." Purbright, on reading it, smiled briefly. By the following Thursday, Mrs. Emmett of the flower shop had received 3 separate orders for anonymous bouquets. One of them included a card with the words, "For her silence." She thought it in poor taste, but fulfilled the order regardless. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, had been tasked with reviewing recent death certificates and burial permits. Flaxborough, with its gentle attrition of septuagenarians and occasional misadventure with garden shares, produced few surprises. Yet among the recent entries, he found one curiously sparse form: a woman buried under the name Lillian Trent. No next of kin, no formal ceremony. Odd, he said aloud, then glanced out the station, window toward the high hedge of Chubb and Sons funeral services. That afternoon, he strolled across and made polite inquiries of young Nigel Chubb, a man whose enthusiasm for embalming fluid was matched only by his interest in cricket statistics. "Miss Trent?" Nigel said, furrowing a pale brow. "Oh yes, private order. Very hush-hush. Gentleman paid cash and brought her things in a cardboard box. She didn't look ill, though. Just still." Love nodded, thanked him, and returned to the station. As he passed the yard gate, he noticed that the undertaker's assistant, a lank young man with a laugh like a crowbar dropped on concrete, was whistling. He was not, Love thought, a man much given to cheerfulness. Miss Norma Glass considered it a mark of breeding to distrust those who read nothing but newspapers. In Flaxborough, where the Bugle and the Church Newsletter comprised the chief diet of intellectual nourishment, this put her at odds with a significant proportion of the adult population. Still, she maintained her little kingdom, the municipal library, with moral fastidiousness and the sort of suspicion more usually found behind net curtains. "Miss Teague," she said, peering at Inspector Purbright over a laminated notice about overdue returns. "I don't recall her borrowing anything. Not even Pilgrim's Progress, which, I may say, is obligatory for newcomers. She once asked about biographies of medieval saints, but she didn't take any. Said she didn't care for dust." Miss Glass gave a little sniff, which rather tells you all you need to know. Purbright nodded with professional neutrality. "And yet, you recall her." "Oh yes. We remember the ones who don't belong." It was a remark offered without malice, merely as a statement of civil order. In Miss Glass's view, a person who lived in Flaxborough without a library card was very nearly stateless. There was a brief pause, filled by the rustle of an elderly patron turning the pages of a gardening periodical with excessive deliberation. She dressed well, Miss Glass continued, as though conceding a technicality. Not overdressed, just enough to suggest she'd been somewhere larger. Not London, I think. Perhaps Norwich. Purbright inclined his head. And did she speak often with others? Any companion visits? Miss Glass suppressed a sound that might have been amusement or mild indigestion. She spoke to others, but not with them. There's a difference. I doubt anyone knew where she lived, or what she wanted. But she did like to be noticed, not wanting it. Outside, the autumn light shifted faintly across the war memorial. Purbright took his leave with quiet appreciation and walked the short distance to the registrar's office. The clerk on duty, a woman with a brisk, defeatist manner and an immovable brooch in the shape of a weeping angel, consulted the electoral roll and property tax logs. No one of that name currently.
Worked his routine, splitting wood, checking the mule's gait, mending a loose hinge. But each task felt heavier. The cabin smaller, with another soul inside. He caught Toby watching from the cot, not trusting, not afraid, just waiting. For what? Jasper didn't ask. 3 days later, they came. Jasper stepped outside for kindling when the mule snorted, ears twitching toward the ridge. There, in the pale gray light, stood 3 figures, their breaths clouding in the cold. Women, Apache, their long skirts swaying in the breeze. Jasper's hand drifted to his holster, instinct honed by years alone. The tallest stepped forward, her deerskin dress clinging to wide hips, the loose laces at her chest parting to reveal the soft swell of her breasts, rising with each steady breath, her eyes, unyielding, locked on his. "You have our son," she said, voice low. No threat, just truth. Lila, she'd later call herself. Behind her, Mira, younger, her dark hair loose, gripped a knife at her belt, eyes darting like a hawk's. Nora, softer, older than her years, stood hunched, her fingers twisting a frayed shawl, gazing past the cabin as if expecting ghosts. Jasper's jaw tightened. He glanced back at the cabin where Toby slept. "He's inside," he said, voice flat. Lila nodded, waiting. Mira stepped forward, her bare legs taut under a short skirt, cracked feet bleeding into the frost. "We don't stay where we're not wanted," she spat, her voice sharp as the blade she clutched. "You'll turn us over to soldiers, won't you?" Lila's hand shot up, silencing her. "Enough," she said, eyes still on Jasper. He saw it then, the weariness in her stance, the dust caked on her moccasins, the way her body curved with both strength and exhaustion. She'd walked days, maybe weeks, to find this boy. He knew that kind of searching, the kind that leaves you hollow. "Come in," he said, stepping back. They moved silently, Lila leading, Mira glaring, Nora trailing like a shadow. The cabin's warmth hit them, and Lila crossed to Toby, dropping to her knees. The boy woke, scrambling into her arms, his face buried against her chest, her hands cradling his back. Mira stayed by the wall, knife still in hand, while Nora's eyes softened, watching the reunion. Jasper slid a tin cup of water across the table, then set out jerky and hard bread. "Eat," he said. Lila broke the bread, handing pieces to Toby and the others, her fingers brushing the table, steady but worn. Mira hesitated, then took a piece, her gaze never leaving Jasper. "Why'd you help him?" Lila asked later, her voice soft but probing, as Toby slept against her. Jasper rubbed his neck, the old scar on his jaw itching. Didn't feel right leaving him to die. She studied him, her lips parting slightly, breath catching in the firelight. Her dress shifted, revealing the curve of her thigh, and Jasper's eyes lingered a moment too long before he looked away. Something,
A modest bouquet, slightly squashed, wrapped in yesterday's bugle. This was left outside the cemetery gate, he said. No card. Just lilies. Purbright took the flowers and placed them carefully on the windowsill. He said nothing. Then, after a moment, he asked, "And how's young Chubb?" Love blinked. "Oddly chipper. Whistling, sir." "Still?" "Yes." Purbright considered this for a moment. "Funerals usually don't improve a man's mood." "No, sir." There was a pause. "Unless," Purbright added, "they're not really funerals." And with that, he returned to his desk, opened his notebook, and under the name Lucilla Teague, wrote a single word: unregistered. The monthly meeting of the Ladies' Civic Rectitude Circle commenced, as ever, with the ceremonial clearing of throats and the passing round of overbuttered shortbread. Mrs. Glossop, whose grasp of both morality and biscuit rigidity was firm, opened proceedings with her usual invocation. "Let us be clear," she said, tapping her teaspoon against the teacup as though it were a gavel, "that rectitude, while a personal obligation, must be maintained publicly." There were murmurs of assent, all tempered by indigestion. On the matter of the fate post-mortem, raised, not without mischief, by Miss Fowle of the committee's refreshments sub-branch, it was agreed that the spillage at the tombola stand had been unfortunate but morally neutral, and that the accordion soloist's musical selection, though regrettably brisk, could not be construed as indecent. But soon, as was customary in Flaxborough, the conversational current turned subterranean. "I wonder," said Miss Fowle, staring too intently at her own teaspoon, "if there's been any word of that. Friend of the lodge." This phrase, so artfully imprecise, required no elaboration. "She has not been seen," said Mrs. Glossop crisply, "nor heard from, which, under the circumstances, may be considered tactful." There followed a silence that was not empty, merely crowded with speculation. "I seem to recall," said Miss Beaver, a former schoolmistress, whose chief distinction was her memory for the social missteps of others, "that she was once introduced as a cousin of Alderman Kirtley. There was a communal inhalation, the sort made only when local aristocracy is invoked." "Kirtley," Mrs. Glossop said slowly, "has denied any such relation. He claims confusion with a cousin on the Fen side, one who went in for millinery." "Millinery?" Miss Beaver's brow arched. "I had rather gathered she went in for masonry." The shortbread was now quite untouched. Elsewhere in town, Sergeant Love, who, though rarely entrusted with diplomacy, had a knack for earnest politeness, was visiting the Flaxborough Historical Society, whose headquarters occupied the old coachman's quarters behind the library. Here he met Mr. Pomeroy, a man of encyclopedic irrelevance, who catalogued everything from militia buttons to municipal paperweights. When asked, vaguely, about old photographs of civic functions, Mr. Pomeroy became instantly animated. "Banquet? 1963? Ah, yes. Grand year. Roast swan and a speech by the mayor about the invention of the umbrella. Quite controversial." Love, allowing this to pass unchallenged, watched as Pomeroy unearthed an album, its leather cracking with satisfaction. On the third page, the banquet photo. There she was again, Lucilla Teague, seated among the Masonic elders, dressed with tasteful ambiguity, wearing the same peculiar brooch. The caption beneath read, "Commemorative Banquet, Flaxborough, Loyal Masonic Lodge number 397, honoring Brother Edwin Perridge. Brother Perridge, Love repeated. Grand old chap, said Pomeroy. Bit fond of ecclesiastical metaphor, but not unkind. Fell down a hotel lift shaft in 78. Survived, of course. Is he still in town? Oh, yes. Lives near the canal now. Collects glass eyes. Love blinked. Pardon? From antique mannequins. All very tasteful. That afternoon, Inspector Purbright took it upon himself to pay a call on Mr. Perridge, now 90 and seated permanently in a chair that faced nothing in particular. His hands rested on a tartan blanket, as though uncertain whether to retire or compose memoirs. When offered a photograph of the 1963 banquet, Perridge gazed at it for some time. Yes, he said eventually. That was a good supper. Haddock mousse and bad speeches. And her, Miss Teague. Lovely type. Not a regular sort. Purbright smiled faintly. She wasn't a guest of the lodge, officially. Good heavens, no, said Perridge. Unofficially, though. Very helpful with our internal frictions. Listened, mostly. Good at that. She hasn't been seen of late. Perridge nodded. Well, one doesn't stay visible in Flaxborough too long. Not if one wishes to be left alone. Did she have trouble? Perridge considered the question. Oh, yes. But the useful sort of trouble. The kind that gets people talking quietly and behaving decently out of fear. He fell silent, then added, She once told me she hoped to be remembered with neither affection nor clarity. I think she's getting her wish. As Purbright rose to leave, Perridge motioned toward a glass-fronted cabinet in the corner. Second shelf, he said. Third from the left. One of hers. Inside, among the glass mannequin eyes and faded Masonic ephemera, sat a small green hair comb. Purbright did not touch it. Back at the station, a letter had arrived for the vicar of St. Maudwin's. It had no return address, was written in slanted hand, and read, She was not the first. She may be the last. No signature, no clue. But its arrival, quiet, unremarkable, deepened the stillness that had begun to settle over Flaxborough like a folded cloth. Purbright read it twice, placed it back in its envelope, and locked it in the drawer with a mild sigh. Outside, the air was beginning to turn. It was not uncommon for the Reverend Claypole to be consulted in the course of a moral upset. In Flaxborough, such upsets tended to take the form of unreturned cake tins, immoderate bingo enthusiasm, or the wearing of trousers by women over 70. His counsel was delivered with a mild stammer and the manner of a man hoping to be contradicted. That Sunday, however, the disturbance had not been doctrinal, but corporeal. It occurred shortly after evensong, just as Claypole had finished putting away his surplice and was preparing to lock the vestry. She was waiting, he told Inspector Purbright. Very still. Didn't seem to blink much. Asked to make a confession, though not in the, formal sense. Said it was about identity, or the lack thereof. And what did she say precisely? Purbright inquired, seated beside a decaying fern in the vicarage drawing-room. Very little, said Claypole. Something about a borrowed name. That she was living under one, or rather, had died under it. Then she fainted. Convenient, murmured Purbright. Claypole inclined his head. Indeed. I brought her round with barley water. She left quickly. I believe she may have taken the wrong glove from the coat rack. He produced it now, a dainty green kidskin thing, with the initials LT stitched discreetly in one corner. Lucilla Teague, said Purbright, examining it without surprise. Claypole, more uncomfortable than usual, peered into the fireplace as if hoping a moral lesson might leap from it. I assumed she'd simply gone peculiar. It happens this time of year. But the mention of dying under another name, I thought perhaps you should know. Purbright thanked him, accepted a stale bath bun with diplomacy, and took his leave. The path from the vicarage wound past the public library, where the newsboard outside bore that week's North Flaxborough Bugle. One of the items, sandwiched between a notice about bin collection changes and a piece on marrow weights, read, "Mystery visitor returns. Book without account. Library staff puzzled by anonymous return of obscure text. Item not recorded as borrowed. No fingerprints found. Gloves suspected." Inside the library, Miss Norma Glass was restamping books with unaccustomed vigor. She greeted the inspector with the air of a woman who had not been thanked for her vigilance. She brought it in yesterday, said nothing, slid it across the desk like it might explode, then vanished. Purbright took the book in question, Heritage of Stone, an illustrated volume on funerary architecture. The date of return had been entered manually. "I keep the pen there," Miss Glass said, beside the suggestion box, which remains empty. Purbright leafed through the volume. On page 73, beneath a full-color photograph of a late Victorian vault in Dorset, someone had underlined a passage in soft pencil. "An identity sustained by absence is often more powerful than one sustained by presence." Back at the station, Sergeant Love had been chasing less philosophical leads. "I found the property deed, sir," he reported. "Cottage on Hatherley Lane. Purchased last February, under her name, Lucilla Teague. Paid for in cash. No mortgage. None. And it was sold again in June. Same agent, different buyer. Quick turnover. Forwarding address. Listed as not to be disclosed." Though the estate agent made a note. Client requested anonymity due to local sensitivities. "Which is a state agency for the neighbors would talk," Purbright observed. Together, they visited the address, a modest stone building with an arched front gate and a fondness for ivy. The new occupant, a junior solicitor from Sheffield with sunburn and visible nerves, allowed them in after considerable persuasion and the mention of warrants, which Purbright never intended to use. "I only met the woman once," he said, rubbing his neck. "She didn't speak much. Had the look of someone permanently disapproving. Did she live here? Hard to say. Place was spotless. No clothes, no personal effects. Just this." He handed over a crumpled black and white photograph discovered behind the kitchen dresser. Another lodge banquet, older than the previous one, perhaps from the late 50s. In this image, Lucilla was standing, not seated, and looking away from the camera. But the brooch, Masonic, unmistakable, was visible, again pinned to her dress. Purbright folded the photo carefully, then glanced around the Spartan room. A house recently vacated, but without signs of panic, as if the occupant had departed according to schedule. That night, he sat alone in the station, reviewing the items on his desk, the glove from the vestry, the underlined book, the second banquet photograph, and the unclaimed grave marked Lillian Trent. It was not the absence of evidence that bothered him. It was the abundance of suggestion. She had not disappeared. She had become more present by virtue of not being seen. He opened his notebook. At the top of a new page, he wrote, "Lucilla Teague, not formally deceased, not formally alive, maybe managing both states simultaneously." He had just finished the line when Sergeant Love returned, frowning. "Something else, sir." "Yes." "I stopped by the florist. Mrs. Emmett says someone ordered lilies again this morning. No card. Paid in coins. And she remembers the man. Said he was nervous. Kept asking if the flowers were symbolic. What did she say? That lilies are always symbolic, and he'd do better with chrysanthemums if he wanted neutrality. Did he take the advice? Number he bought the lilies. Said they were a tradition. Purbright nodded. Did he give a name? Only this. Love handed over a scrap of receipt paper. On it, in block letters, H. Harbury. Purbright leaned back in his chair. Harbury? The solicitor? The same. And did we not have him down as a lodge affiliate? Yes, sir, treasurer. And do we know where he is now? Love shuffled uncomfortably. On leave. Supposedly cycling in Cambridgeshire, or Rutland, or somewhere else convenient for being hard to reach. Purbright closed his notebook and looked out the window. Rain had begun to fall with civic indifference, watering geraniums and drowning secrets in equal measure. Behind the glass, his own reflection stared back, thoughtful, unsatisfied, and faintly amused. The premises of Chubb and Sons. Funeral services occupied a modest Edwardian villa just off Gannett Street. Originally built for a piano tuner of Methodist leanings, the house now carried a distinct odor of lilies, slow decay, and polished sincerity. Its brass nameplate gleamed with a diligence not reflected in the window display, which offered a faded photograph of a tasteful urn and a slogan, Modest farewell, lasting dignity. Inspector Purbright stepped inside just as the grandfather clock in the hallway began to strike 11. It sounded neither mournful nor respectful, more like a cough held in for too long. Nigel Chubb, the younger half of Chubb and Sons, his father having retired to a caravan in Bognor after a brief misunderstanding involving a misplaced plaque, greeted the inspector with the somber eagerness of a man rarely visited by law enforcement for non-fatal reasons. Good morning, sir. May I interest you in our pre-need planning package? No, thank you, Mr. Chubb. I've come about a matter of record keeping. Chubb blinked. We comply with all regulations, fully certified. All interments and cremations logged with the council registrar. I'm sure. But I'd like to see the entries relating to a Miss Lillian Trent. Buried, I believe, 3 weeks ago. Quiet service. Oh, yes. Chubb's expression closed slightly. That was a special arrangement. Paid in advance. Simple procedure. Private. Indeed. And who made the arrangements? A Mr. Harbury, solicitor, said he was acting on behalf of the deceased. Which, of course, said Purbright mildly, she wouldn't have been at the time. Chubb offered a smile of professional vagueness. I understand your point. They sat in the back office, a room that managed to be both clinical and faintly ecclesiastical. A dusty ficus loomed in the corner like an unusually passive mourner. Chubb opened a leather-bound ledger with care. Here's the entry. Lillian Trent. No next of kin. Death certificate provided. Private doctor from out of town. Body identified by Harbury. Cremation refused. Burial requested. Quickly. Purbright scanned the page. The handwriting was fastidious, the details sparse. No funeral notice. None requested. And the coffin? Standard oak veneer. Sealed at the premises. I oversaw it, personally. Who prepared the body? Chubb paused. Well, we didn't. I beg your pardon? There was no body, sir. Purbright looked up slowly. You conducted a burial service without a body? No, sir. We conducted an interment. No service. The coffin arrived already sealed. Delivered by a third party. A man with a van. I see. Purbright tapped the table gently. And you didn't ask questions. Chubb glanced toward the window. Questions don't do well in our line. They tend to start at grief and end in litigation. There was a silence. Then Purbright asked, "Do you have any supplementary records?" Chubb hesitated. "Well, I do keep a personal log. For things the council doesn't need to know. Private arrangements, irregular timings, late payments. My father called it the second ledger." He retrieved a worn exercise book from a locked drawer. Its cover bore the words, "Domestic Science." Year 9, hastily crossed out. Inside, among notes about delayed wreaths and requests for musical deviations, no brass, per widow's allergy, was an entry. Trent, L., 3 July, sealed coffin delivered by van. Paid cash via Harbury. No embalming. Suspicious weight. Assistant noted faint odor of wax. Purbright read the line again. Wax. Chubb nodded. Like old candles or church decorations. Could it have been artificial? Entirely. I had my suspicions. But the fee was generous, and Harbury insisted all paperwork was in order. Said the family wished for silence. And yet, said Purbright, closing the book, there appears to have been no family. Chubb said nothing. Later that afternoon, back at the station, Sergeant Love returned from his rounds with an expression of both triumph and unease. "Spoke to Miss Glass again," he said. She remembered something odd. A woman returned a library book on stone masonry, but she hadn't checked it out. Miss Glass swears it was Miss Teague. Said the woman looked healthier than ever. Healthy? Glowing, even. As if death had agreed with her. And what did she do after returning the book? Disappeared, again. Purbright folded his hands together. So, we have a woman declared dead under an assumed name, whose burial involved no body, but possibly a mannequin, and who now visits libraries anonymously, returns books she never borrowed, and glows. Yes, sir. And we have a solicitor, Harbury, who arranged this symbolic death, and is now reportedly taking exercise somewhere between Wisbech and obscurity. Yes, sir. And meanwhile, the undertaker's assistant is still whistling. Cheerfully. Jerusalem today. Purbright rose from his desk and walked to the window. Below, the town unfolded in its usual pattern. Shopkeepers preparing to close early out of habit, not necessity. The librarian returning from her lunch break with the pace of someone determined not to admit indigestion. And an elderly man posting a letter with reverence, usually reserved for sacraments. In the far corner of the churchyard, the modest grave marked Lillian Trent stood beneath a hawthorn tree, quiet and inconspicuous. No flowers today. You know, love, Purbright said softly, if one wished to vanish, truly vanish, it might be wise to hold one's own funeral. Love frowned. But she's here. Exactly, said Purbright. And by being here, publicly, symbolically, she's elsewhere, privately, entirely. Love scratched his head. She's hiding in plain sight, sir. No, love, said Purbright, with a faint smile. She's hiding in absence. A long silence followed. Then Love, squinting, said, Sir, you know Mrs. Emmett at the florist? Yes. She says a woman came in this morning, asked for lilies, said she needed them for a habit of remembering. And what did she look like? Didn't say. Wore a hat, paid in coins. Purbright returned to his chair, opened his notebook, and added one more line beneath Lucilla Teague's name. Possibly alive, possibly elsewhere, possibly both. Then he underlined the word wax twice. Mrs. Emmett, of Emmett's Florals and Gifts, had survived 3 husbands and 1 unfortunate business partner, with nothing but her scowl and a superior knowledge of flower meanings. It was said she could silence entire committees with a single stem of rue. Her shop, cramped and over-scented, stood opposite the bus stop, where gossip alighted more frequently than coaches. It was here, amid dusty hydrangeas and a stock of stale potpourri, that Inspector Purbright now stood, gently fingering a card attached to a drooping bunch of lilies. "For what I chose to forget," he read aloud. Unusual inscription. Mrs. Emmett, arranging funeral sprays with the solemnity of a canoness, gave a small sniff. "Bought yesterday. Woman with the look of London about her. Hat far too neat, voice far too quiet, left a faint impression of education. She paid in coins? Silver. No copper. All the same year, mind you. 1976. That's either obsession or mischief." Purbright tucked the card into his pocket. "Did she give a name?" "Number. But she asked after someone who hasn't been seen in years. The man with the moustache who used to recite poetry near the War Memorial." Purbright gave a short laugh. "Mr. Egbert Nash, gone to Eastbourne in '99, now teaches verse to seagulls. Well, she knew of him." Back at the station, the inspector reviewed his notes with the slowness of a man polishing unease. Lillian Trent had not existed, at least not in any local register. The identity had no medical file, no electoral footprint, and no library card. Yet she had a grave, a legal executor, and a sealed coffin. Lucilla Teague, meanwhile, had vanished without fanfare, returned a book she hadn't borrowed, and apparently shopped for lilies with the serene detachment of a woman who knew exactly where she was not. Sergeant Love arrived mid-thought, bearing a paper-wrapped pork pie and a minor revelation. "Miss Teague's flat has been leased," he said between bites. 6-month term. Quiet tenant, cash payment. Landlord says he never met her. Her. Says the name was L. Trent. Claimed she was moving for the air. Left a note on the kitchen table. Do not forward." Purbright nodded. "And where was the note found?" "In the sink, sir." They visited the flat later that day. It was a small upper-floor room over the betting shop, a place of narrow stairs, humming pipes, and lace curtains yellowed not by sun, but by years of dignified denial. Nothing in the flat suggested habitation. No clothes, no photographs. The cupboards held 3 cups, none matching. On the small writing desk was a pressed handkerchief and a cheap ballpoint pen that had written only the words Nettleton Tuesday. After dusk, Love, frowning, said, "That's a village near the border. 2 buses a week." "Which day is today?" "Tuesday." Purbright straightened his tie. Nettleton, approached by a rural bus with the conversational enthusiasm of a hearse, consisted chiefly of a pub, a postbox, and a chapel that once hosted weddings, but now served as a venue for abstract pantomime and craft fairs. As dusk approached, Purbright walked the road beyond the village, where the hedgerows grew tall and privacy came with ivy. He found her at the boundary of an old orchard, standing in profile against the last of the light. The hat was unchanged, so was the stillness. He stopped a dozen paces away. "Miss Teague?" She turned. Her eyes did not widen. "Inspector Purbright," she said calmly. "So you are alive. I've been worse. That will come as a surprise to your grave." She gave a faint smile. "I thought the coffin was tasteful. Was it your idea?" "Number 1 merely allowed it. Some people die of decisions made by others." "A convenient metaphor," said Purbright. "And an inconvenient crime." She turned fully now. Her face was pale, but not ill. Her voice remained perfectly even. "There is no crime, only an escape. You paid a solicitor to fake your death. You arranged a burial without a body. You misled the council, the undertaker, and, arguably, the entire parish. Is belief a crime? In Flaxborough, said Purbright dryly, belief is merely discouraged. She folded her arms. If I'd left in the ordinary way, the lodge would have followed me. You know how they are. Indeed. They're Freemasons, not truffle pigs. Still, the metaphor holds. She glanced at the orchard behind her. I needed to disappear, cleanly. The man I was avoiding doesn't let things go. The secretary? No, she said. He was only ever a dupe. It was Harbury. Purbright nodded, slowly. The solicitor. He claimed to act for you, but you say he betrayed you. He wanted more than silence. He wanted ownership. Of you. Of my past. He found out things, threatened to unearth them, so I buried myself. Purbright was silent. You realize, he said at length, you'll have to reappear. She looked down at her gloved hands. Would it matter? Only to the postmaster, the registrar, the tax office, the undertaker, your neighbors, the Women's Institute, and possibly one undertaker's assistant, who now believes in miracles. She sighed. A high price. I'm afraid dignity often is. He waited. At last, she said, will you arrest me? Not tonight, said Purbright. But you'll come to the station in the morning. Let's allow the lilies to wilt before we rewrite the obituary. As they walked back to the village, Lucilla paused once to look at the orchard. Did you ever wonder, she asked, if disappearing properly is only possible when no one quite remembers who you were? Purbright, after a moment's pause, replied, in Flaxborough, Miss Teague, we remember everyone. We simply pretend not to. Mrs. Emmett, of Emmett's Florals and Gifts, had survived 3 husbands and 1 unfortunate business partner, with nothing but her scowl and a superior knowledge of flower meanings. It was said she could silence entire committees with a single stem of rue. Her shop, cramped and overscented, stood opposite the bus stop, where gossip alighted more frequently than coaches. It was here, amid dusty hydrangeas and a stock of stale potpourri, that Inspector Purbright now stood, gently fingering a card attached to a drooping bunch of lilies. For what I chose to forget, he read aloud. Unusual inscription. Mrs. Emmett, arranging funeral sprays with the solemnity of a canoness, gave a small sniff. Bought yesterday. Woman with the look of London about her. Hat far too neat, voice far too quiet. Left a faint impression of education. She paid in coins. Silver, no copper. All the same year, mind you, 1976. That's either obsession or mischief. Purbright tucked the card into his pocket. Did she give a name? Number, but she asked after someone who hasn't been seen in years. The man with the mustache who used to recite poetry near the war memorial. Purbright gave a short laugh. Mr. Egbert Nash, gone to Eastbourne in '99, now teaches verse to seagulls. Well, she knew of him. Back at the station, the inspector reviewed his notes with the slowness of a man polishing unease. Lillian Trent had not existed, at least not in any local register. The identity had no medical file, no electoral footprint, and no library card. Yet she had a grave, a legal executor, and a sealed coffin. Lucilla Teague, meanwhile, had vanished without fanfare, returned a book she hadn't borrowed, and apparently shopped for lilies with the serene detachment of a woman who knew exactly where she was not. Sergeant Love arrived mid-thought, bearing a paper-wrapped pork pie, and a minor revelation. Miss Teague's flat has been leased, he said between bites. 6-month term, quiet tenant, Cash payment. Landlord says he never met her. Her? Says the name was L. Trent. Claimed she was moving for the air. Left a note on the kitchen table. Do not forward. Purbright nodded. And where was the note found? In the sink, sir. They visited the flat later that day. It was a small upper floor room over the betting shop, a place of narrow stairs, humming pipes, and lace curtains yellowed not by sun, but by years of dignified denial. Nothing in the flat suggested habitation. No clothes, no photographs. The cupboards held 3 cups, none matching. On the small writing desk was a pressed handkerchief and a cheap ballpoint pen that had written only the words, Nettleton, Tuesday. After dusk, Love, frowning, said, That's a village near the border. 2 buses a week. Which day is today? Tuesday. Purbright straightened his tie. Nettleton, approached by a rural bus with the conversational enthusiasm of a hearse, consisted chiefly of a pub, a postbox, and a chapel that once hosted weddings but now served as a venue for abstract pantomime and craft fairs. As dusk approached, Purbright walked the road beyond the village, where the hedgerows grew tall, and privacy came with ivy. He found her at the boundary of an old orchard, standing in profile against the last of the light. The hat was unchanged. So was the stillness. He stopped a dozen paces away. Miss Teague? She turned. Her eyes did not widen. Inspector Purbright, she said calmly. So you are alive. I've been worse. That will come as a surprise to your grave. She gave a faint smile. I thought the coffin was tasteful. Was it your idea? Number 1 merely allowed it. Some people die of decisions made by others. A convenient metaphor, said Purbright, and an inconvenient crime. She turned fully now. Her face was pale, but not ill. Her voice remained perfectly even. There is no crime, only an escape. You paid a solicitor to fake your death. You arranged a burial without a body. You misled the council, the undertaker, and, arguably, the entire parish. Is belief a crime? In Flaxborough, said Purbright dryly, belief is merely discouraged. She folded her arms. If I'd left in the ordinary way, the lodge would have followed me. You know how they are. Indeed. They're Freemasons, not truffle pigs. Still, the metaphor holds. She glanced at the orchard behind her. I needed to disappear, cleanly. The man I was avoiding doesn't let things go. The secretary? No, she said. He was only ever a dupe. It was Harbury. Purbright nodded slowly. The solicitor. He claimed to act for you, but you say he betrayed you. He wanted more than silence. He wanted ownership. Of you. Of my past. He found out things, threatened to unearth them. So I buried myself. Purbright was silent. You realize, he said at length, you'll have to reappear. She looked down at her gloved hands. Would it matter? Only to the postmaster, the registrar, the tax office, the undertaker, your neighbors, the Women's Institute, and possibly one undertaker's assistant who now believes in miracles. She sighed. A high price. I'm afraid dignity often is. He waited. At last she said, Will you arrest me? Not tonight, said Purbright, but you'll come to the station in the morning. Let's allow the lilies to wilt before we rewrite the obituary. As they walked back to the village, Lucilla paused once to look at the orchard. Did you ever wonder, she asked, if disappearing properly is only possible when no one quite remembers who you were? Purbright, after a moment's pause, replied, In Flaxborough, Miss Teague, we remember everyone. We simply pretend not to. The solicitor, Mr. Colin Harbury, had always given the impression of being marginally more refined than the town required. His ties were from Lincoln, his vocabulary from the Times, and his attitude toward townsfolk from a height best measured in fathoms. He practiced in an office above the Midland and South Bank, where the curtains had been drawn since 1979 to reduce light fatigue in parchment. They also reduced oversight considerably. It was here that Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love, armed with nothing more aggressive than polite conversation and a vague reference to recent irregularities, paid a call just after luncheon. Harbury received them standing, though the effort did not suggest welcome. "I'm afraid I'm between appointments." Purbright, glancing mildly at the untouched blotter and an exceptionally still grandfather clock, said, "Then we shan't delay you." They were ushered into a room lined with legal volumes and the scent of old starch. Harbury sat without invitation, steepling his fingers in a manner that might have once impressed a magistrate, if not a conscience. "Your name," Purbright began pleasantly, "has been appended to certain financial matters concerning the lodge, rather enthusiastically, in fact." Harbury's mouth moved slightly, like a man adjusting a story before telling it. "The lodge is a private concern," he said, "and I act only in advisory capacity. It is not uncommon for my name to be included on documents as a procedural courtesy." "Courtesy can be expensive," said Love, unfolding a small piece of paper and handing it over. It was a carbon copy, faded but legible, of a second insurance policy. Not the one currently filed at the station, but another, larger, earlier, and now mysteriously lapsed. Harbury examined it in silence, then laid it carefully on the desk, as though fearing it might stain the grain. "A draft," he said. "Never submitted. It was rejected by the lodge for being overcautious." "Overgenerous, rather," murmured Purbright, "especially to beneficiaries not named." There followed a silence not long, but dense. Into it, Harbury placed a sigh of great importance. "I don't deny the lodge is poorly managed," he said, "but you must understand, it is held together not by good sense, but by mutual tolerance. Their bookkeeping is imaginative at best." "And Miss Teague?" "A distraction," he said, "which I did not initiate, if that's what you're implying." "We're not implying anything, Mr. Harbury," said Purbright evenly. "We're asking about the circumstances in which a woman presumed dead emerged from a garden grave with bruised dignity and no memory of how she arrived there." Harbury looked at the curtain, then the clock, as if seeking something neutral to address. She was a threat to the lodge's peace, and possibly to her own reputation. We offered her a small inducement to depart. What happened next, I cannot say. But you can guess. He did not respond, but the line of his jaw suggested rehearsal. They left soon after, Purbright offering the kind of farewell that implied future conversation. Outside, Love took a breath and exhaled through his nose. "He's hiding something." "Yes," said Purbright, "but not well." They crossed the square, where bunting from the fete still drooped in weary triangles. A stray duck, liberated from the raffle, waddled unclaimed between the war memorial and the vicarage gate. At the station, a letter awaited them. No envelope. Again, it read, "You've asked the wrong solicitor." Harbury wasn't the one Lucilla threatened. Look to the will. The original, not the copy. Purbright handed it to Love, who frowned. "Whose will?" "That," said the inspector, "is the question we shall now ask in 3 directions." Later that afternoon, a discreet inquiry at the records office managed by Mrs. Spink, who wore her glasses on a chain, and her disdain without restraint, yielded an interesting fact. Lucilla Teague had, 2 years prior, been named a secondary beneficiary in the will of one Mr. Adrian Clitheroe, now deceased. Mr. Clitheroe had been an enthusiastic, if erratic member of the lodge, known primarily for his fondness for brass instruments and compound interest. His estate, modest but tidy, had been redistributed following the discovery of a revised testament lodged by his cousin, who, according to Mrs. Spink's margin notes, had a bird of dubious sincerity. "You'll want to speak to Mr. Mortlock," she said, peering over her spectacles. He handled the second filing. Very brisk man. Drives a car like it's rented. Mortlock was not brisk that evening, but cooperative. The second will, he explained, had indeed superseded the first. He had not met Miss Teague, but her name had been removed with legal precision and no small speed. "Pressure from the family?" Purbright inquired. "Not pressure," said Mortlock. "A suggestion made by someone with a good sense of what might be embarrassing. For all parties." "And was that someone Harbury?" Mortlock paused, then gave a thin smile. "Let's say it came from someone who spends more time in the lodge than in the law." By nightfall, Flaxborough sat beneath a slow rain that cleaned nothing but gave the illusion of order. The streets emptied politely, and in a small flat above Witherspoon Stationers, Miss Teague lit a second candle and began writing a letter addressed not to the police nor the lodge, but to a name she'd crossed out 3 times already. Downstairs, her landlady paused at the door, listening. She said nothing, but made a small note in her knitting ledger. "Candle use excessive. Rent may be revised." Back at the station, Purbright reviewed the evidence again. An old will, a forged revision, an exhumed woman, and now a second solicitor. As he turned to switch off the lamp, he glanced again at the unsigned note. His eye caught something. The flourish on the L in look. Distinctive, theatrical, and oddly familiar. He made a mental note to compare it with the choir rosters. It was commonly held in Flaxborough that boys of a certain age, particularly those selected for choir duties at St. Ethelbold's, could not be trusted with secrets, sacred music, or sherry trifles. Yet it was equally accepted that they retained information with the precision of bank clerks and the discretion of parish newsletters. One such boy, Master Benjamin Benji Glubb, aged 14 and notably underfed, presented himself at the police station at precisely 3 minutes past 9, wearing a blazer 3 sizes too large and an expression of equal parts fear and excitement. Constable Love, regarding him with the wariness typically reserved for those bearing either confessions or fundraisers, admitted him to the interview room with a sigh. "I expect this is about the business at the Fit?" Love asked, settling into a chair with a mug of tea and an air of mild disapproval. Benji nodded furiously. "I know who buried the lady." Love blinked. "Do you now?" "I saw them, well, heard them, sort of, after choir practice, behind the vestry." Inspector Purbright, summoned by the gentle press of the station bell, arrived moments later, his gaze calm but not incurious. He greeted Benji with the kind of gentle civility usually reserved for those with over-anxious mothers. "Why don't you tell us everything you remember?" Purbright said, "and we'll ask you nothing about what you were doing behind the vestry after dark." Benji colored, then launched into a recital of events delivered with the earnest disorder of someone who'd practiced it before the mirror. "There had been a meeting," he said, "of 4 men, possibly 5. He'd recognized the voice of Mr. Hargreave. Sounded like he had cake in his mouth. And possibly Mr. Trimble from the post office. The others were more elusive, though one had a soupy voice and said things like confounded nuisance and awkward liability. And the lady? Asked Purbright. She didn't say anything. I think she was asleep. Or something. Benji had not waited to see more. He had run home, written it all down in a diary, then lost the diary under his bed for several weeks until news of Lucilla Teague's reappearance roused his memory and, more pointedly, his sense of civic duty. Very good of you to come forward, Purbright said. May I ask, have you told anyone else? Benji hesitated, then nodded. Told my gran, but she thought it was another one of my fitful episodes. She gave me cod liver oil. Purbright dispatched Love to verify the choir boy's whereabouts and cross-reference his choir practice schedule with the relevant dates. The sergeant returned 2 hours later with a battered hymnal and a timetable, both supplied by Miss Burkett, the choir mistress, who saw no reason to encourage dramatics, even in minor keys. I've marked it, Love said, laying out the hymn book and a map. Benji's practice ended at 7, the vestry windows just here. That would have given him a good angle for overhearing, provided he was, as he claims, hiding behind the lilac bush. Purbright peered at the penciled notes. And the lilac, since removed. The vicar said it was inviting unsanctioned loitering. At this point, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Babbage, the undertaker, who asked, somewhat breathlessly, whether it was entirely necessary for the assistant, young Roger Mallard, to be summoned to the station. He's rather delicate when confronted with authority, Babbage said, dabbing his brow. It's the epaulets, I think. Purbright assured him that no distress was intended, though the inquiry involved a matter in which Mallard's name had arisen, not in guilt, but in proximity. When Roger arrived, pink-eared and sheepish, he clutched his hat like a man who'd been told to expect a firing squad. Mr. Mallard, Purbright said gently, you've been cheerful of late. May we ask why? The undertaker's assistant flushed deeply. I've been seeing someone. There was a pause. Oh, said Purbright mildly. Someone who has recently returned? Yes, Roger admitted. Miss Teague. She's been very kind to me. Said I had an honest face. Indeed, said Purbright. And has she shared any views on what happened to her? She doesn't talk about it. She said it was a chapter to be closed. But she's written letters. Quite a few. Letters to whom? Roger shifted. Not sure. She posts them in the red box near the bandstand. Always sealed. She never uses her name. Purbright made a note, then thanked him. Roger left looking dazed, but curiously, lighter in step. That evening, under a sky growing prematurely dim, Purbright walked to the bandstand himself and inspected the red postbox. A chalky fingerprint, faint but discernible, clung to the lip. A receipt from Clitheroe's old solicitor's office had been dropped nearby, folded twice and damp from the grass. In the hush of early dusk, a figure approached across the green, a tall man in a mackintosh. It was Mr. Hargreave. Inspector, he said, voice low. I think I must speak plainly now. Purbright regarded him with polite patience. I've done something foolish, Hargreave said. Not criminal, I think, but rash. And what would that be? I helped them, not with the burial, not directly, but with the silence afterwards. I was told she'd gone, paid to leave. That was all. The rest, I didn't want to know. And now, she's writing things about the lodge about what she knows, if she sends them. She already has. Hargreave looked away, then back again. Can you stop her? Purbright said nothing. The lamplight flickered on. Flaxborough's postal service, though not famed for velocity, prided itself on discretion. The red box near the bandstand, squat and flaking, had over the years swallowed declarations of love, poisoned pen notes, and the occasional underpaid electricity bill. It was, in the end, the first and final confidant of Lucilla Teague. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived at the offices of Mr. Hector Chittenden, solicitor and once keen organist, 3 of Lucilla's letters had been opened, read, and after a moment's silent astonishment, arranged into a neat pile beside the tea service. Mr. Chittenden himself wore an expression hovering between amusement and civic alarm. "She writes with admirable clarity," he said, passing the papers across. "A precise hand, though the content may cause a touch of dyspepsia among the town's fraternal orders." Purbright read in silence. The tone was firm but unembellished. Lucilla had not, she stated, sought vengeance but balance. Her disappearance 3 weeks prior had been arranged, not by her consent, but by means both persuasive and cowardly. A meeting had taken place under cover of ecclesiastical darkness. Mr. Hargreave, Mr. Trimble, and a third, unnamed but scented faintly of mothballs and fear. They had, she wrote, wished to resolve a matter not suitable for minutes. The relationship between herself and a senior member of the lodge had, in her words, offended sensibilities rather more than any constitution. It was made clear she was to leave Flaxborough, and in return certain charitable compensations would be offered. She refused. What followed? Her sudden faint, the confined night in the cellar beneath the vestry, the panicked
Eugenias persönliche Assistentin, jung, blass und seltsam gelassen. 2 weitere vervollständigten die Gruppe: Arthur Lomax, der Anwalt der Familie, und Clémence de Rochefort, Lady Eugenias französische Nichte, mit roten Lippen, berechnender Haltung und einem Hauch von Verachtung, der sich um ihr Lächeln schlängelte. Poirot begrüßte sie mit ruhiger Höflichkeit. »Danke, meine Freunde. Ich bitte Sie nur um einen Moment. Es gibt Kleinigkeiten zu klären, und mir ist Präzision wichtiger als Verwirrung.« Sir Cedric trat mit gezwungener Fröhlichkeit vor. »Wenn es hilft, Klarheit zu schaffen, Monsieur Poirot, fragen Sie, was Sie müssen. Wir alle können es kaum erwarten, dass diese grauenhafte Angelegenheit geklärt wird.« »Ah, da missverstehen Sie mich«, sagte Poirot leise. »Es geht hier noch nicht um eine Losung. Es geht um Dissonanz. Beginnen wir dort, wo alle ordentlichen Mahlzeiten beginnen, mit dem, was serviert wurde und wer es abgelehnt hat.« Sie sahen ihn verständnislos an. Lady Eugenia und Lady Diana haben das Dessert probiert. Der Rest enthielt sich. Warum? Arthur Lomax zuckte mit den Achseln. »Nach 6 esse ich keinen Zucker mehr. Das beeinträchtigt meinen Schlaf.« Markham nickte. »Ich habe stattdessen eine Zigarette geraucht.« Clémence lächelte schüchtern. »Die Engländer wissen nicht, wie man Birnen pochiert. Ich habe aus Protest darauf verzichtet.« »Merkwürdig«, sagte Poirot, ohne zu lächeln. Ein Gericht, das ein berühmter französischer Koch in einem französischen Restaurant zubereitet und von seiner eigenen Landsfrau abgelehnt hat. Aber gut. Er wandte sich an Diana. »Madame, Sie haben einen Bissen genommen, ja?« »Das habe ich. Es war in Ordnung. Und Sie haben keine negativen Folgen erlitten?« »Überhaupt nicht. Und Sie, Sir Cedric? Sie haben den Nachtisch abgelehnt.« »Ich erinnere mich nicht. Vielleicht war ich abgelenkt.« Dann sprach Annette, die Assistentin, mit sanfter, aber präziser Stimme. Das hat er nicht. Ich erinnere mich daran, denn Lady Eugenia kommentierte die Weinbegleitung und Sir Cedric schaute auf die Uhr. »Ah, die Uhr«, sinnierte Poirot. »Eine Angewohnheit von ihm?« »Ja«, sagte sie und nickte. »Er schaut immer kurz vor dem Abendessen auf die Uhr. Es ist, als hätte er einen inneren Alarm.« Poirots Augen funkelten schwach. Und Lady Eugenia, war sie an diesem Abend guter Laune. Es herrschte Stille. Dann sprach Diana vorsichtig. Sie war scharfsinnig, entschlossen. Sie erwähnte immer wieder, dass sich die Dinge ändern würden, dass keiner von uns wirklich verstand, was kommen würde. Hat sie das Testament erweint? Wieder Stille. Dann räusperte sich Arthur Lomax. Ja, sie hatte einen neuen Entwurf angefordert. Wir wollten uns diese Woche zur endgültigen Unterzeichnung treffen. Und gab es Veränderungen? Ich fürchte, ich kann es nicht preisgeben.
섭취하는 방법으로 변경했습니다. 꾸준한 섭취의 중요성. 사과 식초와 생강 조합을 꾸준히 섭취하는 것이 중요하지만 일시적으로 급격하게 많은 양을 섭취하거나 불규칙적으로 섭취하는 것은 효과를 방해할 수 있습니다. 자연적인 치료법은 꾸준함과 일정한 패턴을 유지해야 그 효과를 볼 수 있습니다. 한 번에 많은 양을 섭취한다고 해서 빠르게 개선되는 것이 아니기 때문에 하루에 적당한 양을 일정하게 섭취하는 것이 중요합니다. 박상호 씨는 처음 며칠 동안 사과 식초와 생강을 섭취하고 나서 효과를 느꼈지만 섭취를 중단하는 일이 반복되었습니다. 그 결과 성기능의 개선이 일정하지 않았고 꾸준한 섭취의 중요성을 깨닫게 되었습니다. 박 씨는 이후 매일 꾸준히 사과 식초와 생강을 섭취하여 성기능을 회복하게 되었습니다. 이 사례는 지속적인 관리가 얼마나 중요한지를 잘 보여줍니다. 이제 사과 식초와 생강 조합을 사용할 때 피해야 할 실수들에 대해 살펴보았습니다. 그러나 이 방법의 효과를 더욱 극대화하려면 간단한 운동과 생활 습관 개선이 함께 병행되어야 합니다. 다음 섹션에서는 사과 식초와 생강을 사용하면서 함께 하면은 좋은 운동과 생활 습관을 소개하여 성기능 개선 효과를 보다 강력하게 만드는 방법을 알려드리겠습니다. 사과 식초와 생강을 사용하면서 함께하면 좋은 운동과 생활 습관 사과 식초와 생강의 조합은 성기능 회복에 강력한 영향을 미칠 수 있지만 이를 더욱 효과적으로 활용하기 위해서는 운동과 생활 습관의 변화가 반드시 필요합니다. 운동과 생활 습관은 혈액 순환을 더욱 촉진시키고 전반적인 체력을 향상시켜 성기능 개선 효과를 극대화할 수 있습니다. 이 섹션에서는 이러한 운동과 생활 습관에 대해 구체적으로 설명하겠습니다. 정맥 펌프 운동, 혈액 순환을 촉진하기 위한 운동 중 가장 간단하고 효과적인 방법은 정맥 펌프 운동입니다. 이는 혈액이 하체에서 상체로 원활하게 순환할 수 있도록 돕는 운동입니다. 혈액 순환이 잘 되면 성기 주변의 혈류도 개선되어 발기력 회복에 큰 도움이 됩니다. 정맥 펌프 운동의 핵심은 하체의 혈액 순환을 촉진하고 성기능을 개선하는 것입니다. 이 운동은 매우 간단하며 특별한 기구 없이 발 뒤꿈치를 10초간 들었다가 내리는 동작을 반복하는 것입니다. 이를 하루 3세트 정도 아침에 일어나자마자 사과 식초와 생강을 섞어 마신 후에 실시하면 하체의 말초 혈류가 향상되고 성기 주변으로 가는 혈류도 증가하게 됩니다. 이 운동을 통해 혈액 순환이 개선되면 성기능,